So you got your new Nikon Z5?
I do.
I got my Canon R5 here.
Look at us with our new gear. So this is the Nikon Z5 with the Nikon 24-70 f4S. And what do you got there?
I've got the Canon R5 with the 50mm RF 1.2 lens.
So yesterday I was messaging with Eric, and he was telling me about he was going to make a video where he was going to test the image stabilization. I said, ooh, my camera has In Body Stabilization also. So I said, why don't we get together and try them out and see what we come up with?
Right.
That's what we did.
So that's one of the selling points of these new mirrorless cameras, especially the R5. I was very excited about it, was the In Body Image Stabilization. So before, image stabilization would be mostly in the lenses, which was great. You'd get 2 or 3 stops, but you'd have to buy a lens that had image stabilization. This now with stabilization in the body, you don't have to have a stabilized lens. You've got it, the sensor will float around a little bit, and you've got image stabilization in the body, which is great.
Right, and now, so this is a 50mm.
Right.
Typically 50mm are not stabilized. A lot of your prime lenses weren't stabilized.
Right.
And you like to shoot with primes. Now, I used to shoot mostly with my 24-70, my 70-200, my 16-35. All of those were stabilized. But, you know, anytime I have a Rokin on that's a 135 f2, it wasn't stabilized. So I had to be really on point with my shutter speeds, otherwise I'd get blurry images. So this is great for anybody that's using prime lenses.
Right, and a great selling point too, but how much stabilization do you really get? That's what I really wanted to know. Now, I would have been happy with, 4 stops or so, which is really a lot of stabilization. Canon advertised 7, and in some cases 8 stops of stabilization. The Nikon Z5 advertised about 5 stops, or up to 5 stops of stabilization, which is reasonable, but 8 stops or 7 stops even is game-changing. I mean, changing photography forever. If you can shoot at 7 or 8 stops of in-body stabilization, you can get shots, depending on what lens you use, of like 3, 4, 9 seconds long. Is that even possible?
Well, let's just break the suspense. It's not.
It's totally not possible, and
Right.
I mean not even close.
So, I mean, you were just saying, he was saying that with the wide-angle lens that he has, which lens was that?
15-35, so
Right.
at 15mm.
You're supposed to get how many stops?
Well, you're supposed to get 7 stops
Okay.
with stabilization at 15mm. And at 15mm, if you do the math, 7 stops gets you to a 9-second exposure.
Handheld, which
Right.
is just not, it's not happening. I mean, we've been messing around with these cameras now for the last little while, taking shots at, a half a second. And a few of the shots, if we took 20, maybe 2 or 3 of them will be sharp. So to imagine 9 seconds handheld is
And I tried. Now it's up to 7 stops. So, I mean, fine, up to 7 stops, 5, 6 maybe? Okay, I would even accept that. But the numbers, and we're going to share the results here with you, the numbers are not even close to that in most situations.
Yeah. Now, and these are both they're new cameras. This is Nikon's latest. The Z6 and 7 Mark IIs just came out, but the Z5 is a month old.
Right.
And this is a couple of months old. So we're not even, right? How long have you had that? A month?
I've had it a month. It came out in July, I think.
Okay. So they're the latest. So we'll see. All right. So how do you want to do it? So let's start with mine. I have the camera set at 70mm. I had my ISO was at auto ISO, so it would just kind of keep the light constant. And I just fired off a bunch of shots. Eric's got a little Christmas decoration over here, and I just took a set of shots going from 1/80th of a second down to 1/2.5 of a second.
Right.
Okay.
So basically, how we're trying to measure it, and again, the claims from Nikon and Canon of how many stops you're going to get depends on how you're measuring it. So, if you measure from the rule of thumb, so on a 70mm lens, you should be shooting at 1 over the focal length, or 1 over 70th. So we chose 1 over 80th to give it a little bit. So you should be able to shoot at 1/80th of a second handheld without any motion blur, without any stabilization.
100% of the time.
100% of the time.
Every shot should be sharp.
And that's what we were getting. I tested out all of my lenses. So I tested at that same focal length, 70mm. I tested my 70-200 lens. Bill tested at the long end of his 24-70 at 70mm. You should be able to get 1/80th of a second, 100% of the time, handheld, no problem. And that's basically what we got.
That's the way it works.
So then going from there is now, how many stops can you take longer exposures, by how many stops until you can't really take a handheld shot anymore.
Right, so we cut 1/80th in half, and now we're at 1/40th of a second.
1/40th of a second, and you're still getting all
About
of your shots.
100%, yeah, 100%. So you keep going down the line. So after that was 1/20th of a second.
And you're still getting all your shots, which you should. So now you're 2 stops of stabilization, and you're still getting all your shots in focus.
But that's, now, the rule of thumb was whatever you're shooting at, you want to keep your shutter speed about that shutter speed. So we're still at 70 millimeters, and now we're down at 1/20th. So let's cut that in half again.
Right, now at 1/10, now you're 3 stops. And at 1/10 of a second, you're still getting pretty consistent results with the image stabilization.
I took a few images, and most of them, I would say 80% of them, one was like a hair off, but it's not bad. It's definitely usable.
Right, and the way that you're going to get the best results with something like this is using a high-speed continuous shooting. So, you know, you line up your shot, you focus, and then you basically just hold your finger on the button, and it's rattling off, you know, however many shots, 10, 15 shots at 1/10 of a second. And, you know, the longer exposures you get, the more effective this is, you know, somewhere in there you're going to get some shots that are a little bit blurry, but you're going to get some usable shots in there too.
So we cut it in half again.
To 1/5 of a second.
This is where things start to fall apart a little bit.
Right. So this is at now 4 stops, basically, in theory, of stabilization. At 1/5 of a second, you were getting about maybe half.
Yeah,
right?
and but I was able to get a sharp shot. It wasn't like it was completely useless. But I wouldn't call this a reliable way to shoot anything.
Right.
Right? Like if you have to get the shot, I don't think that this is a shutter speed you want to be working at. You know, you want to be higher up if you can.
Right now we're getting into the range of
like you really need a tripod.
Right now we're getting to the range of like you're in a test lab. You know, you're in like a vacuum controlled environment. But we're testing it to see what it does. So then we cut that one in half, and now you're shooting at 1/2.5 seconds, or in some cases, I know Canon displays that as 0.4 seconds. And that was where, you know, if you railed off a whole bunch of shots, you were getting like, out of every 10, 15 shots, you'd maybe get one, maybe one that hit.
I couldn't get a sharp shot with this camera, and Eric was able to get a couple with his.
Right, and I had very, very similar results shooting at 70 millimeters with the 70-200 on the Canon R5.
So how many stops is that then?
Well,
that's 5?
So here's where we get into the fuzzy math now, because that's 5 stops from what you would normally be able to hand hold.
Right.
But now you're comparing 100% success handheld versus 5% success handheld is 5 stops. But without the image stabilization on, so now when I shot at 70 millimeters, without the image stabilization and shooting in continuous burst, I was able to get at 1/20th of a second, I was able to get a couple of shots here and there that were actually sharp. And then with the stabilization on at 0.4 seconds or 1/2.5 seconds, I was able to get the same thing, some shots here and there that were sharp. So that's only 3 stops. It's not 5 stops, it's only 3 stops. So if you're comparing 100% accuracy without the stabilization versus 100% accuracy with the stabilization, in both cases we're getting 3 stops.
Okay.
And that's basically what it is. You want to be able to compare apples to apples. Now, that's standing up, handheld, you know, in a controlled environment. You're not outside in the wind or anything.
And your subject isn't moving.
Your subject's not moving.
Right.
But it's handheld. So now the test really was, could we get the advertised stabilization? Now Canon advertises 7 stops.
So the answer is no.
And at 70 millimeters, that's 2 seconds. It's a 2-second exposure. And I tried a lot to get a handheld. I mean, and that's, you know, I was figuring, okay, whatever, I don't know how they measured it. I don't know how they claimed this, but I leaned against the table. I propped my elbows on the table. As stable as I could possibly be. I took probably 30 shots, and I wasn't not able to get close, but I was not able to get a sharp shot.
So there you have it. Now, you know, we're dropping images in as we go here, and you know, I guess when you're editing, like putting this together, we can just mark which each one was, so people can see. But it's definitely a great thing to have. So the point is, you definitely want one of these cameras with the in-body stabilization. It's not as, you know, good as they advertise, but it's something you definitely want, and it's really helpful. Right. Really, really helpful.
Right. There's 2 really big ways that it helps. First of all, you know, obviously shooting at a slower shutter speed allows you to shoot at a lower ISO. So if you're, you know, if you're hand holding and you're getting shots at, you know, 1/60th of a second or something, but in order to do that, you have to have an ISO of 6400, and that's kind of on the borderline of, you know, usable shots. Now, if you're getting even only 2 stops of stabilization, now you can shoot at a slower shutter speed, and instead of shooting at 6400, you can shoot at 1600, which is a lot cleaner.
And that makes a big
that
difference.
Really does make a big difference.
Especially if you're editing,
right,
or you're going to be trying to recover some of the shadows or brighten up the image at all. You'll have more dynamic range to work with. The colors will be better. So that's really important. Right. So it's really a combination of the sharp shot is the most important thing, I think. But you want a clean shot too. So you have to find that balancing act. And these two things working against each other, the ISO and the shutter speed, are fighting each other to get you where you want to be. So if you can lower the shutter speed to bring the ISO down also, you're going to end up with a better finished result.
Right.
As long as they're both sharp. Right?
Yeah, even if it's only 2 stops, I mean, 3 stops is even better. If you can lower that ISO, it's definitely great. And the other place where, even if it's only 2 or 3 stops, it's really helpful is at the longer shutter speeds. So if you're shooting with a wide angle lens, like a 24 millimeter or a 15 or 16 millimeter, again, using the rule of thumb, you should be able to shoot without stabilization, like 1/15th of a second, 1/20th of a second. Now with stabilization, even if it's only a few stops, you're getting shutter speeds of a second long. You can actually get 1 second exposures handheld using the stabilization. Now the difference in one stop between 1/60th of a second and 1/30th of a second is not a huge deal. A huge deal is the difference between a 1/2 second exposure and a 1 second exposure, or a 1 second exposure and a 2 second exposure can make a huge difference if you're trying to capture something motion like waterfalls or some type of motion in a cityscape. It's going to make a huge difference if you can shoot at 2 seconds rather than 1 or 2 seconds rather than a 1/10th or 1/5 second exposure.
Right, and still be able to capture a sharp image.
Right.
So that's really the point. And again, trying to not bump that ISO too high. Right. So if you're new to this and you're just these numbers are making your mind bend, you have to understand the exposure triangle, the ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. And once you have your head wrapped around this, you know how each one of these numbers plays off each other, and they all affect each other. Every time you adjust one, you have to take the other two into consideration. And once you wrap your head around it, this is going to make a lot of sense to you, and then you're going to understand why shooting at a slow shutter speed with a clean ISO is really important, and that's why they advertise this so heavily, and why it's so like these cameras, like, oh my god, I have IBIS in my camera now. Right. It makes a difference.
Right, it does. So what you can basically expect is, I know with the R5 I tested out all of my lenses, and with my EF lenses I was getting about 2 stops of stabilization. With my RF lenses I was getting 2 to 3 stops depending on the lens. With a non-stabilized lens like the 50 millimeter, I was getting about 2 stops. With the stabilized lenses, and this is another thing also, with the stabilized lenses, in the past, I would get about 3 stops of stabilization on my Canon R, which is not stabilized. I get about 3 stops. With my Canon R5, which is stabilized, I get about 3 stops. There's no difference with a stabilized lens between using it with or without a stabilized body. So that's basically what you can expect is 2 to 3 stops of stabilization with really any of these mirrorless stabilized bodies.
And I don't know how the Canon is, but with the Nikon Z system and the Z5, when I adapt an F mount lens, not a S, a Z mount lens here, instead of getting a 5-axis stabilization, it's only 3. Right. So I imagine you're going to get less stabilization also. I only have this lens here, and my other Nikon is my wide angle, and I probably should have tried that out also, but
you would have gotten similar results.
Probably similar results, but that lens is stabilized.
Right.
So where this one, the lens isn't, but the body is.
Right.
Right.
Yep.
I mean, I don't even. No, this isn't stabilized. So they're relying on the body to do it.
Right. Yep.
Okay. All right. That makes a lot of sense.
So basically, in-body image stabilization, a great thing. Don't believe the hype. You're not going to get 5, 6, 7, or 8 stops of stabilization, but the 2 to 3 stops that you're going to get are going to be great. So
in my world, I was just, if you saw my last video where I had some lens compatibility issues with this camera, and I was looking at the Nikon D780, which is almost the same camera as this, same sensor. It has the same video functions as this camera, actually as the Z6, but the one thing it doesn't have is the in-body stabilization. So while this gives up a little bit in frames per second, and the body is not as robust as a D780, the fact that I'm picking up image stabilization with this, right, I think is huge. And having an electronic viewfinder that I can see my shot immediately, I can see my exposure immediately instead of having, the old style viewfinder. And it's $1,000 less than the D780. I really think that this is where the value in a mirrorless camera is. And this is what you got to think about if you're looking at a D750, a D780, you're looking at the Z5, the Z6, and the Z7. So you really have to try to figure out what kind of photography you take. And the same thing with Canon.
Yeah.
You're going to be moving into the Canon RP is a super inexpensive, great way to get into full frame mirrorless photography. It's even less expensive than this. So there are some great options out there. You don't have image stabilization with that camera though. So these are the things you have to think about if you're shopping cameras right now.
Yeah, you have to look at what features are important to you or not important to you. But if image stabilization is one of those things that you think is important to you, know that you're going to get 2 or 3 stops. I really wish they would advertise a little bit differently.
Well, where does Canon, now is this the only Canon mirrorless that has stabilization in it?
This, no, the R6 has it also.
And how much is that?
That's probably about half the price of this.
So it's like 1800. So that's a Z6 competitor.
Basically, yeah.
Okay. All right. So basically the only difference if you're Canon or Nikon shooter is Nikon's entry level mirrorless camera, which is this, the Z5, with a full frame sensor, has the stabilization where Canon's doesn't.
Right.
After that, they all probably pretty comparable.
Yeah. So, all right, that was our little image stabilization rant. We tested everything out. Again, 2 to 3 stops is really nice to have. Hopefully technology in the future will get a little bit better, and at some point we'll be shooting 9-10 second exposures handheld without even thinking.
Either that or our phones will be so good we'll be done with all these cameras, and that'll be the end of it.
So so that's it. We're gonna put up some playlists here that you can check out. One on the Nikon Z5 that we're starting up here, and then on the Canon R line and R5 line, so you can check those out.
Okay, we'll see you in the next video.